Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down some pretty big topics in just a few minutes.
Today, we're going to tackle one of history's most persistent literary mysteries, the Shakespeare authorship question. It's a debate that really pits historical records against some very compelling doubts.
Now, before we go any further, you have to understand this number. This is the percentage of academic Shakespeare scholars who are absolutely certain that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was the author. The consensus is, it's overwhelming.
And that gets us to the real puzzle here. The mystery isn't just who wrote the plays, but why does this question even exist when you have such a strong consensus? It's a story that touches on evidence, psychology, class, even conspiracy theories. So to understand it, we've got to start with the doubt itself.
To really get this controversy, we first have to fairly look at the case for the doubters. They're often called anti-Stratfordians, and their arguments are really built on what they see as major holes in the official story.
So for the anti-Stratfordians, the whole thing starts with what looks like a suspiciously empty paper trail. I mean, for the world's most famous writer, we have no surviving drafts, no letters, no books from his personal library. And you add to that the lost years, this 7-year gap in the records, right before he explodes onto the London scene. The whole picture just feels, incomplete to them. And this gets to the absolute heart of the conflict for the doubters. On one hand, you've got the documented life of this practical businessman from Stratford who, sued people over tiny debts. And on the other, you have the transcendent mind of a literary genius. The question they keep asking is, how can these two possibly be the same person?
This gap, or what they see as a gap, has led people to propose a bunch of alternative candidates over the years. People who they believe better fit the profile of the brilliant, educated author of the plays.
The three big contenders each kind of fit the profile in some way. Bacon, he had the legal mind. Marlowe had the poetic genius. And Edward de Vere had that aristocratic background. The problem? They each have a fatal flaw. Marlowe and de Vere both died before many of the plays were even written. So to make any of them work, you don't just need a conspiracy, you pretty much have to ignore the historical record.
Okay, so we've laid out the doubts. Now, what does the actual evidence say? Let's follow the paper trail that mainstream scholars have been piecing together for centuries.
The first piece of evidence is the simplest one, but it's also one of the most powerful. Publishers started putting his name on the plays. And why would they do that? Because it helped them sell. His name was a recognized, valuable brand in the super competitive London theater market. And this shows his fame wasn't something made up after he died. Not at all. There's this clear, documented pattern of public recognition all through his career. He was praised by critics, named in a royal patent by the king himself, and celebrated by his peers, all of it leading up to the landmark First Folio, the definitive collection of his work published just a few years after his death. And speaking of the folio, you get this incredible tribute from Ben Jonson. Now, this was a famous and famously critical rival and friend. Jonson knew Shakespeare personally for decades, and in his poem, he calls him the Swan of Avon, directly connecting the author to his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. It's pretty hard to dismiss a personal testimony from a guy like Jonson.
Okay, so remember how doubters point to Shakespeare being a businessman as a bad thing? Well, scholars argue that far from contradicting his authorship, these records are exactly what you'd expect to see. They put him at the absolute center of the London theater world, as an actor, a shareholder, and a part owner of the Globe. The guy earned a fortune that was totally consistent with being the most successful playwright of his day. But the case doesn't just rely on 400-year-old paper. In recent decades, modern forensic techniques have added a completely new and, frankly, fascinating layer of evidence to this whole story.
This new evidence comes from a field called stylometrics, and you can basically think of it like linguistic CSI. It uses computers to analyze an author's unconscious writing habits, things like how often they use common words or how they structure their sentences. These patterns, which authors can't consciously control, create a unique authorial fingerprint.
So here's how it works. Computers scan just massive amounts of text to identify an author's unique fingerprint. Then they can take a disputed work and see whose fingerprint it matches by comparing it to the known writing styles of a bunch of different authors.
So what's the verdict when you run this analysis on the Shakespearean canon? Well, the results are remarkably clear. The plays and the poems, they form a single, consistent stylistic group. And that group is clearly statistically different from the known writings of every single major alternative candidate.
And this brings us to the final and maybe the most modern piece of the puzzle.
If the historical and the scientific evidence both point in the same direction, why is this still a debate at all? The answer, it turns out, lies a lot more in psychology and culture than it does in evidence. The whole debate first got going in the 19th century, and it was fueled by some pretty rigid classism. It was then fed by these romantic ideals about what a genius's life should look like. And today, it just thrives in our modern culture, which, let's face it, loves a good conspiracy and the thrill of challenging the experts. And this is the great irony of the whole thing. The very people who claim they're challenging the establishment are often, without even knowing it, reinforcing a very old-fashioned, very elitist idea that genius can only come from noble birth and a formal education, not from a middle-class guy from the provinces. In the end, the fact that the Shakespeare question keeps persisting, it might just reveal our own anxieties about class, about genius, and about authority. It holds up a mirror to what we believe about where great art can come from. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to ponder. Who are we really analyzing when we analyze this debate?